Hi, I'm Caroline Payson, the Director of Education here at Cooper-Hewitt National Design Museum, and I'd like to welcome you here tonight. This week we celebrate design and design education with our third annual National Design Week. Yesterday in this tent we had over 450 high school students, and we were able to introduce them to a wonderful group of design mentors who included Scott Stowell and Tom Kundig, who are here today. Tomorrow morning, we're hosting a business breakfast where the discussion will be about design with representatives from JetBlue, Google, and others. On Friday, we'll be hosting educators from New York City in our Educator Open House. But the centerpiece of the week will be Thursday night's National Design Awards Gala, where we will unveil the People's Design Award winner and will honor the National Design Award winners. We are thrilled to have those winners with us tonight for what promises to be a lively discussion with an extraordinary group of designers from a variety of fields. Before we start, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Target. Without their incredible generosity, none of the National Design Award events or the National Design Awards would be possible. We thank Target for this continued support of design education. I'd also like to tell you that David Rockwell will not be able to be here tonight and extends his apologies. I also have the privilege of introducing the Design Mind winner and the moderator tonight, Michael Bierut. Michael is a partner at the design firm Pentagram and has produced an extraordinary body of critical thinking and graphic design. The jury commended Michael's ability to articulate and deconstruct the design process, which has raised the consciousness of the entire field. He has sparked a national dialogue with his teachings, books, and as co-founder of Design Observer, a widely read and influential blog focused on design and culture. Please join me in welcoming Michael Bierut.
Welcome, everyone. We'll wait a moment while the transparent podium is made invisible, fully invisible. Thank you so much for coming out tonight in all the wind. We're shielded from that in this tent. And as Caroline said, we hope to have a lively discussion with our panelists this evening. I'm going to start with a couple of, I'll start with some quick introductions, then some questions, and then we'll open up to questions from you, the audience, okay? So I'm going to introduce our speakers starting from the far end. On your far right is Scott Stowell. Scott founded the graphic design firm Open in 1998. You're familiar with his work, I hope, on the magazine Good, and New Yorkers will know his new logo for WNYC, our public radio station. Scott's a recipient of this year's award for communication design. Next to Scott is Ralph Rucci. Ralph is the founder of the women's wear label Chateau Ralph Rucci and one of the only two American designers in history to present his collection at the Chambre Syndicale de la Haute Couture in Paris in 2002. Ralph is the winner of the award for fashion design this year. Lucinda Sanders is the CEO of OLIN. OLIN is this year's winner for landscape design. Cindy's been there for 28 years and was appointed CEO after serving as a design principal there. OLIN's work has changed the face of urban centers throughout the world, most notably and positively, in my opinion, at Columbus Circle here in New York, where they led the long and worthwhile transformation of that critical part in the center of Manhattan. Next to Cindy is Tom Kundig. Tom is a partner in the Seattle firm Olson Sundberg Kundig Allen Architects. As an architect, he's well known, if not legendary, for his integration of buildings and the natural landscape, for his innovative use of materials, and for his ability to reconceptualize the relationship that the inside of spaces have to the outside world that they occupy. He's the winner of this year's award for architecture design. And finally, immediately to my left is Charles Harrison. Chuck served as an industrial designer, as the lead industrial designer for Sears, Roebuck and Company for 3 decades. He created during that period an astonishing 750 different products for every area of the home. I can almost guarantee that one of those products is in one of your home's areas. He is the winner, and quite rightly so, of this year's Lifetime Achievement Award. So first, welcome our panelists. Some of the panelists wanted to know if they could hear the questions in advance, and they were not told the questions in advance because I sort of have been making them up as I've been talking to them briefly right before we went on stage. And so you'll be hearing unrehearsed and presumably honest answers, starting with a question I'd like to put to Ralph. Ralph, is design, in your opinion, a luxury or a necessity?
I think it's a necessity. Can you hear me? I think it's a necessity because you have to feed luxury and feed the need and the desire and purpose for good design. So I think it's a definite necessity.
Scott, do you agree with that? That it's, I mean, it seems to me that one of the questions I always have about the National Design Awards is that I just wonder whether it matters to the larger world outside. Obviously, I know that's the intention of the awards, but then sometimes I fear that it happens on such a rarefied level here on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that it's some of it's kind of inaudible or invisible to the larger world outside.
I think, can you hear me now? Yes, okay. We can't hear ourselves, so. For me, I think design should be a necessity. I think for a lot of people it is a luxury because they just have other things to worry about or they don't know that it exists. It's like universal health care or something. Like, it should be a necessity, it is a necessity, but for most people it's out of reach. So they just don't know about it so much, the regular average person. And I think for designers, sometimes that's almost to our advantage, you know, that we still...
How so?
Well, you know, back in the day before computers and so on, what most of us did was much more rarefied. Like, it was like a weird surgeon or something, like, you know, and it would take a week to do something that takes an hour now. So there's a little bit of that left where people don't know how these things are made, and I think it would be better if everybody did and they knew all about it. But what I mean by it's to our advantage in some cases is just there is a little bit of air of mystery about it. Sometimes.
Air of mystery indeed.
There you go.
Go on, sorry.
They're good with the sound cues. And, but I do think it's something that everybody needs, but not everyone really knows what they need or knows that it's out there.
You raised universal health care, and one of my questions was to have each panelist describe his or her plan for universal health care. But we may not have time for that. Cindy, your firm, OLIN, in a way, does work that I think a lot of people experience without knowing that they're kind of having a design experience. You know what I mean? They just find themselves in a space, find it incredibly pleasant, and partake of it without spending a nickel, you know, without sometimes even being fully conscious of it. Are you surprised with what happens sometimes with places that you've designed after they are out in the world and regular people are using them?
Sometimes. But I want to answer your first question.
Please do, please
because I think great design is a necessity. And maybe because we do so much work in the civic realm that we believe in bolstering all of society through great design. That's one of our premises in our studio. Are we surprised at how spaces get used? We love it when people invent the use of spaces. We do and speculate what might happen there. But down at Wagner Park, I don't know if you're familiar with that, and the tip of Manhattan, we designed this lawn with a bench that wraps, and we never envisioned that it would become one of the favorite play spaces for nannies and kids in Manhattan. And it's a great transformation of that space, in addition to the wonderful civic use. So we kind of delight in the invention that people bring to space.
Yeah, Tom, architects sometimes are notorious for being really prescriptive, if not dictatorial, in mandating what sort of things happen in their buildings, the position of the window shades, the use of the closets, if the architect has chosen to provide closets. It's the same question to you. I mean, what happens to your buildings after you design them?
Well, yeah, that's actually a good question. I also want to answer your first question because I think it's.
I promised them that I would not do this thing where I said I'd like each of the panelists to answer the same question down. But please get to that. Yeah.
In a way, I think it kind of ties into the answer your question to me. One of the mistakes I think we all sort of make when we sort of codify or sort of make design sort of academic in a way is we forget everybody on the face of the earth is designing every day. When they sort of look at a functional issue and they make something out of it and they're sort of designing it, they're fixing it, they're changing it. That in a way is what I do every day. I'm given a set of parameters, I'm given a set of budget numbers, I'm given a set of sort of physical sort of realities of how to make these and assemble these things. The client is very much part of that. And that's always been the most interesting part for me is how to engage sort of my DNA with the client's DNA, the craftsman's DNA, into whatever we're doing and make something out of it that none of us really could have done individually. So I think the mistake some architects make is that in fact they think that their line, their DNA, is in fact the only line. In fact, it's a relatively thin solution ultimately. And if you can kind of involve a group of people into the solution, it's a richer project ultimately.
Yeah, Ralph, do you have an image when you're working? Do you have an image in your mind of who your client is?
No, not a living human being, but let's just say characteristics of various clients, whether dead or alive, or memories or educated ideas of a certain woman. No, if I find it very restrictive if I think of one group of people, because then so often you're just dressing that group. I think you have to think conceptually about how women want to think without thinking overtly about clothes. But I wanted to address the first question because because I was the first person and I was short about it. Not only do I think it's a necessity, but it has nothing to do with financial position. It's so important to know that it helps one get up in the morning, as some great person used to say, to just see luxury. It could be subliminal. It might not be part of it or part of your daily life, but in passing the Duomo, you're inspired.
So, Chuck, is design a luxury or necessity?
Can I address the first one?
I don't remember what the first question was.
Well, unquestionably, for me, it's a necessity. But when I hear, and I've heard this evening, the word design, and most of us, I think, go to an end product, a finished, something that's completely finished. It's a product of something that's been designed. But I also think that design is a process. And it's a thinking process, and design is problem solving. And we don't have to have a finished product to design. I mean, you may organize a letter, you may organize your pantry, you may organize your bedroom or your food on a plate. That's designing. It's thinking through a problem and how do you get it to be attractive, how do you get it to be appealing, how do you make people want to have it? In our case, since we're all commercially oriented here, and I can reflect on a story that I tell, I tell it as a true story, and I hope it is. But I heard this, that design actually helped our country overcome the depression of the 30s. Now, in light of what's happening to us today in the crisis, financial crisis, it may get a chance to help pull us out again. But prior to the 30s, the products and things that we had to deal with were purely functional. Almost everything just functioned. And the idea of having it beautiful or having it aesthetically pleasing was a coincidence. It was an accident, as a matter of fact, if it happened. So if we apply, our craft to products, it can be very, very essential that we make people want to buy them. Is what we're trying to stimulate the economy now and get people to spend. And I want to take that offshore a little bit, because we're also concerned a lot by a lot of manufacturing leaving our shore and being made offshore and brought back. However, a lot of that designing, the planning of those products that come back to us from a foreign place is designed, for the most part, here, sent away, and then brought back. And I think that that can be very vital to us as a stronghold here, to continue to hold, not only hold, but to steer the direction of design that we need as human beings, and not let it get out of hand and go frivolous.
So do you think that design, in a way, is a global language?
Yes, I do.
Is it, I mean, like, Cindy, you've worked in a lot of different places.
Right.
Do you find that you have to tailor your approach to the work that you do, depending on whether you're working, in North America or Europe or Asia or wherever?
Well, this is a very contemporary topic. I also teach at the University of Pennsylvania, and we had a faculty meeting last night, and we were talking about this very issue. And it's a pretty serious issue, because exporting design, I think, can sometimes send an air of arrogance about it. Our own studio, wherever we work, we try to get into the culture, understand behavior, understand history, understand the locale. That's very important to us. But one still can't separate oneself from one's life experiences. And as I say, it's a very hot topic, and the faculty was roaring about it last night. So I think there isn't one opinion out there about international
and I would say
design.
that part of, I mean, when Ralph used the example of seeing the Duomo and being inspired by it, I mean, you don't have to be, Italian to be inspired by it. It's sort of, it does, but yet it is, unmistakably a product of Italian culture. And, and just, it's funny because, and this may seem parochial on my part, but I've always thought that Tom's work was sort of quintessentially about, the American Northwest. It just always looked very much like that to me. Yet you must not, you're not consciously trying to do that.
No, yeah, I've heard it described as the American West also. Yeah. And here's a bizarre story. I was contacted a couple of years ago from somebody in Islamabad, Afghanistan, to do a project. And I said, well, don't you have some troubles there that would preclude building something? But he said, no, everything was a little shaky, but he wanted to do this project. And I was disturbed kind of by his answer to the question. I said, well, I really, in order for me to understand what you're looking for, I want to go and visit you in Afghanistan and see how you live and your culture, and begin to understand, because I absolutely knew really nothing about it. He said, that's not what I want. I want something from the west coast of the United States in Afghanistan. Now that project has never gone ahead, but it was kind of in my mind, kind of a disturbing conversation, because in fact, what he was asking for, born and raised in Islamabad, was something from the west coast of the United States.
And I think that is one of the issues. You go to practice in India, and when you start plugging into the culture and trying to understand perhaps some of the techniques that they have historically used for great design, and talk about those things, and they might turn to you and say, no, we really want something from the West. We don't want that old stuff. And that's difficult for us, no matter where we are. I mean, it could be even within this country, when we try to tap into something more regional.
Sorry, go on.
But of course, that being said, much of the culture of our West is in fact influenced by the culture of Asia. So there's this.
You can't deny those influences.
It was where do those edges really, those overlaps, those crossovers really define themselves? And it's a difficult question to answer, I think.
You know, we did a project in Taiwan, which is not going to get built, but one of the things we tapped into was exactly this notion of trade, because a lot of the plant material has come from all over the world. And so we were trying to capitalize on that as a theme to the landscape. Plants, materials, woods, etc. And that was very deliberate on our part. You're right, trade and exchange of ideas is huge in design. You can't help but be somewhat influenced.
Yeah, and I think that Chuck's designed some objects that I think of as being quintessentially American, but no less appealing as objects, you know, around the world in a way for all that. Do you know how many Viewmasters were manufactured?
I had one.
No, but if I were able to have a royalty of just 1 cent on each one that was sold, I probably would not be sitting here right now. No, I really don't. I do know that that product ran unchanged from about 1958 through 1993, 4, unchanged. I mean, the form factor remained the same. There were some changes in color, but that was just the same molds, the same tools, everything stayed that way. And in fact, I think it's still being produced today. Now that happened to be a product that would cross all cultural lines. I've traveled, you know, around the world, and I remember once when I was in Hong Kong, and I'm walking down the street, and on the Kowloon side was a Russian supermarket, a big box store almost, that sold everything in there. And I look in the window, and there's a Viewmaster. You know, no, but you know, they had to have some appeal there for it, and so to that point, I think I would not like to have that charge that you were asked to make something from the West, because that would be very difficult for me today. I don't think, and I've come from a product design base, you know, and when the products are designed now, they're almost by the nature of what's going on in technology, which we all have access to. We all have access to the same materials now, and even if we want to make a product that the material is not indigenous to where we live, it's easy to export, you know, to bring it in to make a product. And whoever's going to market and sell this product has to sell in an international climate, because if they stay in a very small community with it, they can't survive. So I think as far as products go, and I'm speaking for a product designer that couldn't come here tonight, but in any case, I think you're going to see many of these products will be identical.
Scott, Good magazine that I know you've been involved with from its founding, I think engages with a lot of these issues of you know, globalization and the role that, you know, capitalism and manufacturing plays with you know, with the world at large. And I think it does it uniquely from a design point of view in a way, partly I assume because of your involvement with it. Can you talk about how you conceived it and what point of view the magazine has?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that's funny after this conversation about globalization, you know, the only other magazine I've really worked with before Good years ago was Colors, which is all about these issues of mixing cultures.
Yeah, Colors, the Benetton magazine that was created by Tibor Kalman, yeah.
Yes, and Good is different in that it talks about global issues, but it has a uniquely American point of view. And it's funny, my experience in the past saying, oh, let's do this from a neutral point of view that's not saying we're American, doesn't happen with Good. Good is about America in some way. And in fact, the first issue was all about I Heart America, they called it. But what's interesting about Good is that their frame of reference is that things don't have to be the way they are. It's basically young people who are doing things that basically either don't know what they're doing or doing things in a new way, or both, which is always exciting. And this kind of mix of culture doesn't happen so much, but it's all about looking at things the way they are and saying it doesn't have to be that way. And with the magazine, we're trying to do the same thing with the design of the magazine and by extension the editorial, which is to say it is a normal magazine. It has covers, has short things in the beginning, long things in the middle, stuff you might want to buy, stuff like that. But so it is mainstream in the sense that it's trying to talk to normal, regular people. But within the content, there's this assumption that, you know, things are changing and they're not going to stay the way they always were. So in some sense, what we're trying to do is have kind of new content in a form that's somewhat familiar, although it might look different in some ways.
Yeah, as a fellow graphic designer, I mean, one of the things that I notice in a magazine is that you have a different relationship in a way with the audience than perhaps an architect or a landscape architect or a product designer or a fashion designer might, in that in a way you're kind of creating this conversation with it. And have you been surprised, the same question I asked Cindy, have you been surprised sort of at what people reacted to in terms of subject matter and what they seem to have wanted more of and what they want less of?
Well, it's interesting, you know, having worked with them from the beginning, when, again, they said, we want to make a magazine, how do you make a magazine? I mean, not that we told them how to make a magazine, but they figured it out as time went on. The design has really been an integral part of the editorial in a way. And most designers will tell you stories about like, oh, there was no headline, so I had to write the headline or stuff like that. But I mean in a more fundamental way where the clients, the editors and the staff there are very open-minded to saying, to designing the magazine even from an editorial point of view. So sometimes we'll say, you know, not always successfully, but sometimes we'll say, oh, this could be a shorter piece with this kind of images, and it would say something different. And because there's a lot of work to do, and that means it's getting closer to being finished, oftentimes it happens. But there's a lot of back and forth between the words and the pictures. So, like you said, it's unique for us to be able to try to help someone use their words to talk to people. And a lot of these issues of those cultural issues apply in a very different way because it's just based on language. So, you know, somebody from Afghanistan can't call us and say, make a magazine about California for Afghanistan, because it just doesn't make any sense. It's very different.
I noticed, I mean, it also seems the magazine is looking for new channels and new ways of reaching the public. I was in Starbucks this very morning and saw at the takeout counter a free, very small, modest, single-page sheet. Can you describe what the idea of that is?
This is a new project. Well, to step back for a second, basically, Good started as a magazine, but the plan all along, which is starting to come to fruition now, is really to build a community. And to build a community of mostly young people, mostly in America, but around the world, that basically want to change things and connect together and talk about that. So the way it started was through the magazine. There was a website that's now become more complex, and now they're starting to find other ways to reach people. And one of them is this thing called the Good Sheet, which we can't take actually much credit for. It was done primarily by the staff at Good, and what it is a one-page kind of broadsheet that is distributed through Starbucks. And Starbucks, of course, sponsored it to an extent, but there are actually other ads in it from other companies. And what's interesting is that to get somebody this kind of more sound effects. To get somebody this little piece of content in a place where they wouldn't expect it is really exciting. So the one that we can take credit for comes out next week, and it's about the closest elections ever in America. So of course it's a week before the election, and in it talks about Bush versus Gore, 537 votes, other elections, 80 votes, 70 votes, 1 vote. Which was a mayoral election in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The mayor was elected by 1 vote. So,
and the implication, of course, is
go vote, and which you should vote. And so, the idea is for Good, they want to reach these people wherever they can, and they're willing to. They're very practical about it. Like I said, the magazine is meant to be a mainstream magazine with interesting content, but they're very practical. A lot of groups or people in that position wouldn't want to go through Starbucks. And they saw an opportunity to reach people that are susceptible to interesting messages that they wouldn't expect. And so far it's been pretty interesting.
Yeah, Cindy, when I've worked with landscape architects, including on occasion with OLIN, what I've noticed is that of any discipline, landscape architects seem to me to be the most agile at dealing with very, very complicated multi-level audience groups. To do a project like Columbus Circle, let's say, you're dealing with the Department of Transportation, Department of City Planning, you know, the community board, I assume tons and tons of different things, and then somehow have to do a major capital-intensive project where you not only can satisfy all those groups, but come up with something that'll delight people in the end. How do you approach a project like that? And how do you somehow manage to retain control of it?
Well, I think it's a misperception that we retain control over it, but
but that doesn't just design itself, though.
No, it doesn't. Landscape architects oftentimes have called the great collaborators, and it is one thing that our studio works very hard at, in collaborating across the boards. We think that the ability to engage in conversations with engineers, with architects, with community boards, with the public is absolutely essential. It's the only way we can get a great project. We are, oddly enough, very dependent upon others, yet we possess what I will call an ability to synthesize a ton of information. We tend to see the big picture. Those of us who work in the urban realm as we do, I think have developed that skill and honed that skill.
And you paint a positive sort of picture with all these different players out there, all of which are well-intentioned and aiming for the same positive outcome. But in my experience, and perhaps I've been unlucky compared with you, I've dealt with lots of jerks, and, you know, who sort of, in fact, you know, are begging not to be indulged and somehow have to be dealt with. So, I mean, it sort of is, you must have had, there must be real frustrations when the stakes, luckily for, you know, I'm a graphic designer like Scott, and the stakes for us are relatively lower, at least they are in my case. I think when you're really talking about doing something that will change the space of a city for, you know, generations, the stakes are very high. And so when suddenly you find yourself up against something that you think really makes a difference, there must be a moment of truth.
Well, you know that we are a partnership of 6 partners, and Lori Olin, who is our eponymous partner, perhaps has the greatest gift of consensus building, and I think all of his partners have learned from that, and it really is, it's a skill set. Yeah. And that's not to say there aren't challenging people to deal with, or people who have very strong opinions. And one has to work through that and to build consensus, to try to build consensus. And it isn't easy. I don't want to say it's easy, because there are multi-interest groups, and I will say that the West Coast is probably even more difficult to work on than the East Coast in that regard. Everybody has an opinion.
Unlike here, yeah. I'm guessing people in the audience would sort of feel that your opposite might be Ralph, who, based on at least my stereotypical idea of a fashion designer, kind of conceiving things in isolation and just kind of being, you know, inspired, you know, as an individual, and then coming up with a creation and just finding an audience for it. But I'm guessing you would say you have collaborators as well.
Yes, I mean, I always say I don't function alone. I might start off conceptually with where we're going, but over the years I've surrounded myself with technicians and people who help me create the body of work that I can't function without. And I pull them in, and I use this word Chato in my label to make an emphasis on the great people that I have working with me. But when I start off conceptually with what I'm going to do, no, it's an individual effort. But then the totality of how it occurs involves so many of these people.
And the same thing is true with architecture, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. Again, the work that I'm doing and the work that Cindy and the OLIN partnership does, there's a difference there. They're working on much larger scale projects, and the overlap of the community is much more complex. The work I've kind of intentionally tended to want to work on is more singular client-based, whether it's a representative of a group of people or if it's a singular client. So there's more of a one-to-one relationship. Now that very quickly goes into the pyramid of all the people that are working on it. And that's, I think, what Ralph is talking about. That pyramid is really where the energy happens. But at some point, that energy kind of goes to a point where the hard decision has to be made. And it's normally the client or it's normally the lead on the design. But at some point, it has to be collected and then presented.
That happens in our studio too. Obviously, there's a partner who's making a lot of the hard decision and is trying to steer and navigate. But I do think where we differ is how inclusive we have to be in that process. In our studio, we're very inclusive. We try to be very inclusive. And obviously, as we move to the external environment, we're very inclusive there as well.
I've sort of been waiting to ask this question. I actually could come here and just do a Charlie Rose type thing just with Chuck Harrison for 2 hours, I think. So I'm just going to indulge myself if you don't mind. Chuck, how did you get started back in 1961? Can you do you remember your first day?
Sure.
What happened?
Well, I needed a job. I had returned from the military. I served drafted for 2 years, and I returned to graduate school and couldn't stay in school because I went broke. And so I went looking for work, and I was in the Chicago area, and I scoured the town, and finally connected with a fellow, Carl Bierut, who was a manager of product design or industrial design, Sears Roebuck and Company, and he thought that he could find a place for me. You know, now I had been called by a lot of my classmates who all happened to have been working at different design firms, and they'd say, "Chuck, just come over here." He says, "There's an opening." He said, "Why don't you hustle over?" So I'd go over there, and as soon as I'd walk in a place, they no longer needed anybody. You know, I was the answer to everyone's employment crisis in Chicago. I could just walk in a firm and automatically they had more people than they needed. But when I met this one fellow, he said, you know, says, "Let's start the process of employment." And I went through several interviews there. And on the second or third interview, I came back, and Carl was very uneasy. I could see it in his face, and he said, "Chuck," says, "I have to tell you this, I can't hire you." And I said, "Yeah, well, we're done with the interviews?" He said, "No." He said, "But I've learned that the company has an unwritten policy against hiring African Americans." So he said, "However, I have a freelance budget, and I'd like to hire you on a freelance basis to provide ideation studies for my furniture design group." And fortunately for me, I had a fairly strong foundation in furniture design. I don't know really how I got it, except just pure interest in it, I guess. However, that's how it started for me. I got on there as a freelance designer, and I really was broke. I was living in a YMCA, and I'd do my work at night, and one of my professors at school knew that I was in town and was seeing some tough times, and he allowed me to come into his firm and use a drawing board to do my work. And although he couldn't hire me at that time, he did. And then when that budget expired, the freelance budget, a stroke from heaven came down, and one of my other professors called me and said that my partner and I are going to separate and go different routes. They were architects and industrial designers. They were both together. He says, "Lou is going to pursue more architecture, and I'm going to pursue more industrial design, and I'd like you to come work for me." So I said, "What time do you close?" He said, "That's okay, you can come tomorrow." And I did. And that was really my first real professional assignment where I was working in a design firm. And from that point on, believe it or not, I never had to look for another job. People called me and asked me because everybody in town knew me. I mean, they knew my work. I had been by there. They just couldn't, come across with an employment opportunity. So that was the beginning.
And has it changed since then? In how many different ways has it changed?
Oh, for me personally?
Yeah, personally or just?
Yes. Well, I had really a wonderful life as a designer. I had an exceptional turn, and I don't think many people, regardless of their ethnic group, would have that, and it had to just, I don't know how it came about, but I got work in a sequence of design firms that specialized in different areas of products. My first real assignment was as a furniture designer, and I was immersed in furniture design for a couple of years, and then I thought, well, if I want to really be an industrial designer like Raymond Loewy, I need to be able to do other things, So I went out and I answered some of the calls for other products. Then I went to a firm that specialized in electronics, where I had a chance to design for every electronic brand name in America, and some outside this country, as a matter of fact. And then from there, I went. Finally, my last stop was at Sears Roebuck, where I really began to learn. Actually, in one of the later consultant offices, I began to pick up the business. And to the point I knew I had client relationship, and I learned how to estimate the product, time to get a job in and get it out so that we could make money. I was kind of straw boss in the office, where I was able to, was required, as a matter of fact, to manage the other people in the office. And then on to Sears Roebuck, where there was really a venue unending. I mean, I designed every product that they sell. I mean, in every product line, at least, from toys to automobile products to sporting goods to craftsman tools to major appliances to all kinds of electronics. And I really developed to a point that I felt that I was as good as they come. I had the opportunity to work with manufacturers all over the world and interact with engineering and management and with firms. And there's no secret to anyone, but in most major, what should we call, merchandising companies like Sears, Target, the others, do not really have own manufacturing companies, but they do contract with other organizations or other businesses or manufacturers to make product specifically to their own design. And that was a really a wonderful place to grow and learn, and I was able to work with manufacturers who were very limited in their scope and ability to produce product, and some giants who had no limitations in terms of their capability. So I had a fun time.
If you ran into some parent of a teenage kid, yes, and they said, my kid is smart, does well in school, could be a doctor, could be a lawyer, but he or she wants to go to design school, what should I tell them?
The one thing that they can do, any parent, and it probably is not limited to design, but I do teach now at a couple of different colleges, and I know that probably the strongest input you could give, or blessing you could give, is to have the parent and the community support that child. There's nothing tougher than a student in design, particularly, who has parents and relatives that don't understand what they do and don't bother to learn, and support them. And that will carry them past the hump. It's a very frustrating profession for all of us. There are times when we doubt ourselves, excuse me, when we have, you know, peaks and valleys. Why, I would tell that parent, whatever that student does as a designer person, get in the boat with them and help row it.
Did all your parents understand what it is you do? Yeah. Well, you know, my mother often, when she gave up finally telling people what I did, she just said, "Oh, I just say you're an architect, and that's enough." So, Tom, I'm not surprised. But Cindy or Ralph or Scott?
I think my parents pretty much understood what I did. I came from a background with parents who are very interested in the landscape. What I think they probably didn't understand is how I was making a living doing the things that they love to do as a hobby. That was really a trick.
Ralph, do you
not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all. I come from a very conservative Italian family from Philadelphia, and if I would have said I wanted to be a priest, I think they would have been in heaven. They wanted doctor, a priest. That was it. And so I studied literature and philosophy in college before I decided to do this suicidal gesture of entering fashion design. And actually, my dad is still alive and he gets it now, but it wasn't until I think a significant moment occurred that they said, oh, this really does have some reality to a resemblance of respectability.
And do you think, does it have, because of the popularity of, say, Project Runway, does it have too much popularity now, do you think?
Project Runway?
Yeah. There used to be a mystery about what fashion was. Sorry. You'd be surprised how many designers think.
But that is the fashion design business.
Scott?
I think I got design from my parents. I mean, my dad worked as a printer for almost 40 years, so basically, finally destroyed me. My dad worked as a printer for many years, and wow, now it's really loud. And he would bring stuff home from work, like press sheets and pieces of film and stuff like that, and say, here, play with this stuff. And I guess I did. And so he definitely, that interest in printing stuff and words on paper and all that stuff, I think definitely came from there. So
is that a common thing, I think, for all the panelists, that somehow the impulse that actually led you to where you are now started just with the idea that you could have some stuff and make something out of it? I mean, Scott, actually, you said earlier that the philosophy of the magazine is things don't have to be the way they are. And I think, you know, that experience you had just with paper and things, I'm guessing that most of the other panelists here at one point sort of discovered that they could take some things that were in front of them and make something out of them, you know, not a dress right away or a landscape right away or a product right away or a house right away, but something that actually led you on a journey that ended, well, it didn't end, but it's for this evening brought you here. True?
Yeah, I mean,
or is it a cliche?
Yeah, well, my background's a little different because my dad is an architect, and so I grew up in that business. But I also, I think when I said to my parents that, you know, I actually was more interested in physics, frankly, and they were completely supportive of that because, of course, the architecture profession in the 60s was pretty difficult. It was very difficult. So they thought it was actually a terrific profession for me to think about. And when I came around and I realized that really, for me, the physics of nature was actually interesting on one level, but then there was also the poetics of, well, you know, that intersection between poetry and the rational, which is architecture in many ways. And I came back and I said I wanted to be an architect. I think they were slightly appalled, you know, that this was, I mean, this was not an easy decision. And I think Charles said the same thing. The design professions, all of them are, you have to be committed. You have to be, it's 100% commitment to what we do. And it's something that, and I'm not an academic, but when I do lecture, I try to make that clear to the students that it's a choice. It's a life choice. It's a life commitment. And I think maybe, to answer your question, maybe I saw that as a child growing up with artists and architects, that in fact this is a serious commitment. And so actually I left home not wanting to be an architect, but then I came around and realized it.
Yeah, Ralph.
Could I add something? I have a feeling, I would assume that everyone sitting up here can do. Can you hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. Hello? Oh. I have a feeling that everyone sitting up here could actually, besides the creative idea, just the idea, but can take it completely through its stages and actually make and produce it. And that's a very key principle, I think, in design. Besides the realization, and the conceptualization, but the actuality of it, to actually make it. I think that's very important.
Yeah.
I think everybody can hear.
I think that's true. I mean, one of the things that I was very influenced by was this understanding that landscape could be manipulated. And my dad, more from an agrarian perspective, and my mother making my dad manipulate landscape more from an aesthetic purpose, and to the extent of managing woodlands and creating gardens and building stone walls. And so that was very influential in my own upbringing, and I know that every one of my partners has had a type of influence like that. And when one transitions out of childhood, I guess, into kind of career discovery, if you will, that realization that there's a much bigger world out there and people do make gardens and one can craft these things. The act of building for us, getting our landscapes built, is essential. We are not conceptual landscape architects and leave it there. We have to bring it into a very high level of detail and finish. So big idea to the built piece.
Yeah, Tom.
Well, I was going to say, that's my background. My mentor is actually an artist that specifically wanted to build his own sculptures because he felt that the anomalies and that the perfection of the work happened during the fabrication of it. I agree with that completely, but there's a real bifurcation that's happening in schools of architecture, and I don't know, I'm going to ask, there's an amazing statistic of the architects that graduate from Columbia University that end up in gaming. Does anybody know what it is? It's something like 20% or 30%.
End up in like video games?
Video games.
Or croupiers in casinos.
Pixar. Yeah, that's true. No, not croupiers. Oh, maybe. But it is in the imaginary realm. It is in the super real. And it has nothing to do with the making of something. It has, well, I mean, that could be a discussion right there, whether they are really making something, but it isn't that tactile sort of thing that you're actually manipulating, that material. It's the digital realm, and there's right now in architecture, there is, I mean, even in our office, the difference between some of us that are from the old school, we use pencils, we use watercolors, we use pens. A lot of the kids that are working for us now have a hard time with pencils and pens. And I think there's a loss that's happening. That's my perspective at this point. Why am I surprised? Yeah. And I don't know where it's going to go.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I think the flip side of being able to make things is the people that experience the things that we make becoming aware that they were made by someone. And I can remember, you know, I talked about my dad bringing home this stuff from work, and I remember at a very early age looking at like letters on a page and thinking, how did they make that? Did they draw that? Like what physically made that? And of course it was film and a plate and metal maybe or whatever. Now it's computers and so on and ink. But I think, you know, to bring back even your first question of the luxury versus necessity, I think most people don't stop to think about that kind of thing, and they don't know that everything's been made or designed or all these decisions have been made. And I think there is that moment, maybe for me it was when I was a kid and I realized where it came from, and other people it might be at other times when they look around and they realize, wait a minute, somebody decided to make that thing that way, and that's when for them it does become a necessity, because then they understand, wait, if everybody made some decisions, I better know what's going on and figure that out, because otherwise all the decisions are going to get made for me and I won't know anything about it.
Well, since you gracefully brought it back to the first question, maybe we can go to the audience and see if they have some questions for us up here. We'll have a microphone brought around to you so that everyone can hear. So there's a question right there in the middle. Raise your hand up nice and high, and the microphone, Scott, you can hold on to that microphone in case you need it. It's right there. Stand by. Right there. There you go. Okay.
Thank you. I just want to ask if each of you could have worked in a design discipline other than the one that you have practiced, what would it be?
Chuck?
And probably architecture.
Oh, Tom, we'll save you for last. No, go ahead, Tom.
Well, industrial design, absolutely.
Changed it.
Okay, Cindy?
I hate to be so narrow. I can't imagine doing anything other than landscape architecture because of its breadth. There isn't a boring day, really. Always something new.
Ralph?
I wouldn't change.
Psychiatry. It's the most fascinating thing.
There was a moment when I was a kid that I wanted to be an architect because Mike Brady on the Brady Bunch, he got to stand up at his desk at that cool table, and then I realized, oh, graphic designers have the same thing. That's cool. And of course now we're stuck with computers and stuff, and I don't have that cool desk anymore. So I think I'll stick with graphic design.
No one has it. Exactly. Another question. All the way back there.
Hi, I'm curious if any of you have ever hit a stumbling block in your career where you've seriously considered doing something else.
Yeah, who came close to quitting? Tom?
Yeah.
What happened?
Ooh. Well, geez, I think, again, it's back to what Charles was saying earlier. It's a very frustrating business that we're all in, regardless of the discipline. I mean, the discipline of design is a commitment, and I think you, at some point in your career, don't see a path, or you don't understand how it all sort of fits together, and I think you sort of question your decisions at that point. It was early on in my career, so it was kind of when I was making that transition from more geophysics-based to architecture, and I wasn't quite clear where it was. So if that's a stumbling block, I'm not sure. It was not late. I have to say, once that decision was made, I couldn't be happier doing what I'm doing right now.
Yeah. I'd like to add to that. I think for most of us, and most of you, who have pursued a discipline of design, it soon becomes more than just something that you like. It becomes a lifestyle. And you get consumed by it. And I think after a while, you don't think there's anything else to do in your life other than what you do. It becomes a passion, and you stay with it.
Yeah, and one of the nice things about design, in my opinion, maybe you agree, is that and Scott, you mentioned this at the beginning, I think, is that you can define it in a way. The definition is actually quite loose. And sometimes no one knows quite what it is you are supposed to be doing. And in fact, Ralph, I would guess you actually do, on occasion, get to practice psychiatry. Yeah, in the course of doing, your official work. And I think, in a way, that expansiveness, it's not, it kind of permits you to kind of redefine it as you go along, which I think makes it's very hard to actually be doing it. I don't know that many people who just kind of like do it up to a point, then get frustrated and say, I quit, I can't do this thing anymore, just because this thing is so possible to define so broadly. Yeah, in the front row, right there.
Yeah, my question is, what are some of your inspirations that are intradisciplinary? Like, we know that architects are influenced by nature, fashion designers are influenced by art. If you could all maybe say some of the other things that are inspiring to you, science, whatever.
Anyone? How do you get inspired?
Well, I think as landscape architects, we are greatly influenced by many things. Obviously, the ecology of a place, the topography. We also access ideas of art. That's important to us. And with 6 partners, I think we have a fundamental belief that the social success of spaces is essential. That's a fundamental tenet that all 6 partners agree on. When we talk about influence and where the narrative might come from, I think that's where the individual expression of each partner enters in. And some of us are greatly influenced by art. Others are far more influenced by ecology or history. So,
well, it's a good question because sometimes when I'm asked that question, I think it's a question of your childhood. And my childhood is Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho. That was lumber mills. Sort of a logging industry back when I was a kid. There was mining that happened a lot in that area. And then of course the big landscape, the big beautiful landscape. So as a child, if you're sort of immersed in that kind of, in agriculture, and you're immersed in that sort of place, I don't care where you're immersed as a child, that becomes, I think, a foundation for your inspiration. So I think it's different for everybody. Clearly, today, I'm 54 years old. I'm still making decisions based on childhood experiences, and I climbed mountains for a number of years, and that as a kid, and I can still see the direct influence back to what I did, and still affecting me as an adult.
I'd like to just ditto that same expression. I grew up in a rural area. I was a country boy, and so I looked to a lot of things that not man-made to inspire me, just the flow of a stream or a tree, a leaf. Or, for instance, I frequently reflect on probably what I think is the most beautiful thing that exists, and that's an egg. I think it's functional, it does what it does well. It's easy it protects the yolk, easy for the yolk to break from the inside, to come out, protects from the outside, and its form is just perfect. And I think that shape is just right. Think what a issue it would be for that chicken to lay that thing if it had corners on it. That's perfect. But there's one other bit of it, place where I find, I think of industrial design at least, as a 3-sided discipline. Even though it depends where you come in from, and you could probably come in, but I think of it as science, art, and business. And I think you could be inspired by either side of that discipline, to ignite something.
I think one of the things that we're facing as landscape architects is we have to be influenced by all of those things today. People are expecting it, clients are expecting it. The very deep personal stuff that comes from childhood, or a sense of poetry, a love of art, a love of jazz, I think all of those things do weigh in on a personal note.
There's a couple.
We'll go right there in the front row there.
Sort of to dovetail on that, you talk about the collaboration, you talk about the impact of various personal influences, and then to layer in the effects of globalized society that we discussed earlier. How, with all of this impactive exposure, do you resist homogeny or the watering down of an idea by all of the impressions upon it from exterior sources?
Anyone? Scott.
Okay. I think there's a difference between, having connections with a lot of different people and doing things by committee. For us, to me, part of what being a designer is, graphic designer in particular, but any of these disciplines, is dealing with people, and the psychiatry as well, and clients, and your collaborators, the people that work for you, with you, the end users of your things that you make. And I think the homogenization comes when people get lazy. And they think, oh, we have to address a lot of people. Let's just do it in a way that everyone will kind of not hate that much. Instead of deciding to do things that are really specific and targeted, sounds too marketing speak, but they actually are meant for people to really experience in specific ways, and to accept the fact that other people might not get it or might not like it. And I think that the bad side of globalization in terms of, this homogenization you talk about really comes from forgetting that if nobody doesn't like something, then nobody else will actually really like it. So I think you have to make choices about what you want to make that will connect people in very specific ways and not in these general ways that, that lead to what you're talking about.
I think you really have to believe in something when you're selling it, too. We have a saying in our studio that we listen very carefully to what people want, but we don't listen when they tell us how to do it. That's a very fine distinction. And we don't win everything, but I think we have principles and ideas that we're striving to incorporate in our work. And there's a very fine line between, will I get censored, between being bitchy and making, a compromise. It's very fine. And we have to walk that line all the time. When you're so protective of a design, sometimes you turn people off. That's a fine line to walk in a design world, I think.
Well, one of my mentors, Massimo Vignelli, who was the 2003 Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, used to say when I worked there that designers are like doctors in that we don't want people to tell us how to operate. We just want them to tell us where it hurts. And I think that's the difference between people saying what it is they want as opposed to dictating how to do it. And I think that's, and I think that it's up to us to inspire the confidence as designers that we actually can deliver the goods and know how to do it, which goes back to Ralph and Tom's point, and the point that others have made about being able to follow something all the way through from the beginning to the end. There's a question in the middle there, I think. I'm going to go to the back there.
I would like, I'm going to ask you if you would revisit this whole idea of virtual reality and narratives that come off of virtual reality, because as we speak, people are incrementally, day by day, learning their aesthetics and their questions about aesthetics from a virtual standpoint. So what do you think your disciplines are going to look like? What are going to be the questions for you if you were working 50 years from now?
It's one of those questions. Well, Tom, you raised this whole virtual reality thing, so you started this.
It's a minefield, I think, because I am still in a basically a profession or a business or a calling that is making shelter. I mean, the stuff we make, this is a shelter. This is as ancient as we are as human beings. It's the whole idea to enclose space so we're protected from the wind and the rain and the cold. And virtual realities don't do that. You can put the helmet on your head and you can feel like you're in this room. It still doesn't answer some functional questions which we need to survive as animals, basically, as beings. So in architecture, I'm thinking that what we're going to be seeing is that the way these real places are made is going to be much different. That the way our hand is digitized to something that is described, that ultimately something is manufactured, will be much different. But everything we're doing today has everything to do with millions of years of our evolution as human beings. So I just, it's kind of like I'm not trying to avoid the question, because I think it's a really good question. I think we are seeing, again, I mean, we are seeing with some of the students' work and some of the work that comes out, and well, even architects, we'd always say, you know, if you draw something, it's not real. Actually, it's a two-dimensional sort of drawing, or it's a three-dimensional diagram of something you're describing. It's not a real thing. The real thing is ultimately what's built. So even a digital reality is not much different than I think, a pencil reality. I'm not sure about that, but
May I say something? I think that's an extraordinary question. But the way you pose it and the way we think about it is that it's an either-or situation. Too many of us think that with advanced technology, the hand loses in importance, where the eye or the verbal interpretation is not as important as the computerized. And then it becomes almost so precious, if you will, the couture of looking at things. Perhaps if we don't see it as being so precious, it'll disappear. And then later, in years, it might become a cliche of itself. But I don't think any one of us that works in this realm should let go of it. There's nothing archaic about it. It's not a process that's from the old world, or bespeaks the old world. To use the hand in architecture is the correct way. To save time with the computer loses the human emotion, the vision, and I think the possibility of the artist, the architect, being in communication with a higher source.
Yeah, I mean, would it be...
It's not an either-or.
I mean, would it be correct to say, and I'm thinking of you, Chuck, that the tools that we use, the processes by which the work is done, has evolved radically and will continue to evolve, but somehow at the end of the line is an experience that at the beginning is an idea that's expressed, you know, by a single person perhaps, and then at the end of the line is, you know, another person who's kind of encountering that idea and having some kind of experience. So it must have changed radically from, you know, over the course of your career, how what physically happens to do that work.
Yes, I do have concerns, you know, about how we get an image or a concept from our heads onto paper or communicate it in some form that someone else can interpret it and actually build it or make it. And I frequently get nervous about, particularly in the classroom where I have students who immediately go to a software program to do their designing. I have two concerns. One is I don't know how they can communicate a thought onto something digital without having it interrupted. It's not a flow of things as though it would be if it was at your fingertip. Now, that's not probably an issue or a big deal, because if no one has ever, you know, has an appreciation for any other thing than what they see, then they can accept what I call a compromise. Because I don't think that if a designer limits their capability to create to a software program, they can't go beyond what that software package will allow them to do. And that's where I get concerned. So I think that we might, over time, settle for something less than the best.
Right there.
When you're doing design, you know, you have certain restraints. Either there's budget restraints or there's a finicky client or something. Do you think having those restraints strengthens your design or weakens it?
For me, it couldn't exist without them. I mean, basically, if you're an artist, you make up those restraints yourself. If you're a designer, you're dealing with these constraints or restraints in the world. And for me, the more of them there are, the more fun it is. I mean, you can complain about clients that want like a big logo or whatever, all these cliches, but, and I've said this there are some of my students here and they've heard this story a million times, but the constraints that you're given are like a gift. That combination of things that you have to deal with is not something you could come up with yourself. So there's a client who's a jerk, it has to cost $5, it's due in a week, it has to be pink, and it's about who knows what. You have to, that's a puzzle that you get to solve. It's a gift. And you can come up with something that you would have never come up with on your own. So for me, if somebody comes to us, which has never happened, with an unlimited budget and we can do whatever we want, actually, that would be kind of cool. But if they came to us and did that, I would just sit there and not have any idea what to do. It's like, well, what is the point of the thing then? And it's part of it's problem solving, and part of it is just, I think the mind of designers is one that likes to kind of solve these little tricky puzzles. And that's, to me, what makes the work interesting.
I couldn't agree more. And I think a true designer is fundamentally an editor. And I think the mistakes that I've seen over the years is there tends to be sort of this indulgence in architecture, that there's almost too much, there are no constraints, and there's sort of an indulgency that begins to emerge. And I think when you do have the constraints, you learn how to edit, you learn how to be efficient, you learn how to be careful, and ultimately it leads to better design, because design is about that moment, that genius moment where everybody just goes, it's perfect. And it's hard to find, but I think it's always based on the discipline of constraints.
And you know, I think that this museum in particular wrestles a lot with, you know, whether, you know, its purview being design. You know, what is design? And it seems to me that this idea of constraints actually is one of the things that makes design what it is. And any designer, particularly any, you know, designers that are coming out doing mass-produced objects or objects for a lot of different people to use, you know, end up, whether or not, no matter how much freedom they think they have, they're actually operating under, you know, stated and unstated parameters that actually end up, their ability to manipulate those parameters is really what makes them successful or not.
Well, and I think Charles was talking about it. The nature of nature is one of the most disciplined sort of systems out there. You know, it's survival of the fittest. And nature, if you just, the whole biomimicry sort of discovery is, I mean, clearly nature is a system of efficiency, is a system of discipline, because it's trying to find the least possible way to survive and exist in the system. And usually that's survival. That's a pretty strict constraint right there. And it tends to sort of lead to a beautiful, the egg or the leaf. I mean, those are incredible designs.
Yeah. Back there.
Hi. Can I address the first question, luxury versus necessity? You've spoken a lot about, you know, the necessity, the fundamentals, the rules of design. I'd like you to address the purely aesthetic or decorative or pleasurable aspect of design, and at what point, with each one of you, I'm sure you have different answers with your respective practices. At what point does the line start to go from design into more a territory of aesthetics or art or ornament?
Tom?
I'm not going to answer that one. That's a dangerous one. Yeah.
Who wants that one?
Yeah, who wants that?
Oh, I thought, yeah, Tom, I thought you were eager to jump in. Cindy, if you think about it, what's funny is that every profession up here, there's in a way some corollary that any person here in the audience, or indeed any person out there, kind of acts in a way that sort of is similar to it. So I think, you know, even someone who's making a garden at home doesn't conceive of themselves as a landscape architect by a long shot, but they're still, you can plant a garden whose only function is to, grow food you can eat. You can plant a garden that's only function is to please the eye as you look at it, right? But I mean, it seems to me that designers are ones that have learned to navigate the path between those two things, as any landscape architect who's good must, right?
Well, that's true. I mean, I think if I understand the question, it's what he was really asking is, at what point does a decision move into the realm of design and become artistic, or, I don't know, I don't like the word embellishment. That sort of doesn't...
This is the age-old question, yeah. When does craft become art, or art become craft? And,
that's another symposium you could hold here.
Absolutely. I mean, the artist I used to work for, he said, Guy, every time people ask me that question, I always answer, I'm just going to keep doing whatever I'm doing and let somebody smarter figure it out than me.
Well, for me, it's really simple. I'll connect your question to the last question, which is, to me, if you're talking about all these constraints of the work that you're doing, there's one more constraint, which is just stuff that you like. And your personal taste and aesthetics and so on, I mean, we can deny that that happens, but clearly people make things that they like to look at, or that they enjoy, or that they think are beautiful, or ugly on purpose, or something. And so if you combine that constraint with all the other constraints of the project, and it still works, then I think those two things can happen at the same time.
I wrote a little obituary for Wilson Pickett, the soul singer, who died a few years ago. And I was reading a book about soul music in the 60s, and there was an interview with Pickett, and he was asked what his philosophy was. And he says, my philosophy is harmonize, then customize. And I remember reading that and being like dumbstruck. It seemed like a perfect definition of what designers have to do. You have to harmonize, meaning that you have to figure out some way to satisfy all the parameters of the project. $5 has to be pink, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have to customize it so that it gives people pleasure in some, so it has within it the potential of giving pleasure in some unique, memorable way. And I think if you can kind of do what Mr. Pickett kind of advised all the time, there'd be a lot of very nice design solutions out there. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'll go right there. So keep your hand up. There we go. So, no, in the back, hand up.
She wants to.
Hi. This has been a very basic question, but I've been thinking about it as how do you get to where you are? There are three factors that play an important role. One is being passionate about design. Two is being or starting a career in the right company. And three is how much importance does socializing play? I mean, so does socializing get you to be in a good company, where you can be more passionate? Or being more passionate gets you into a good company and then you socialize? So which is what works? I mean, to be a good designer.
You mean socializing like cocktail parties?
Sorry, not quite. I mean, just meeting, getting to know people. Yeah. And because sometimes when you're doing a lot of design, you're just in your own box and you really don't want to get out. And
yeah, so,
I think you have to be very passionate, first of all. I think that's the first thing. And you have to find a company that shares, or where you share their vision and can learn within. To me, that's kind of the way it goes. As far as connecting, whether you're in school, whether you're in academia or working for a company, I think you're always making those connections, no matter what you're doing. But if you're passionate, I mean, if there are designers out there who are not terribly passionate, they should not work in a firm that is very passionate. That's a bad mix. You know, we work hard in our studio, and we expect others to work hard too. Somebody who isn't passionate shouldn't be with us.
But the last point you raised, which I mean, like hard work and passion, would that be sufficient if you were incredibly introverted and couldn't bear to really talk to other people? I don't mean we're dead mute, but I mean if you had no real ability to kind of make connections with other people. How important is that last thing? Is socializing in effect? Not cocktail parties, but. Well,
I think an introvert has an ability to socialize. We actually have two of our partners who are introverts, so they just need more time away to recharge their batteries. But I do think it is important to be able to connect and to be able to be willing to engage with others and to listen, in our studio anyway, because we are a collaborative studio. Right, we work together. We expect somebody to come to the table with ideas, and we expect to be able to listen, and we expect to be able to direct and people to hear. So that's important.
There's a fourth element. I always recommend this to students, and you have to be patient. Rick Joy is a good friend of mine, and he and I share something that is kind of important. Our careers really didn't change until we were about 33 or 35 years old. Even though Rick was a drummer and I was climbing mountains, we were sort of figuring out where we were going. Call them our lost years. And I think there's the fourth element is patience. I think if you can be passionate, you can be, you don't have to be, I don't think you have to be an extrovert. God knows I'm not an extrovert. In fact, I actually avoided kind of getting to know architects. Even in architecture school, I just found there were other groups I was more interested in. Those have become very close friends. They have nothing to do with what I'm doing now, except they actually do have something to do with what I'm doing now, because they sort of feed my fire about what I'm interested in. But patience, I think, is one of the most important things to have. And
I'd have to say that patience is critical too. Whoever asked the question earlier, did you ever come across a stumbling block? I think we figured that 4 out of the 6 partners actually left the firm at one time, myself included. David Rubin, my partner, who went off to do product design. And I do think that we would all tag that somewhere around our 30s where that crisis happened. And patience is critical.
Ralph, other people, patience?
Well, to address the question, yes, patience I think is essential. Perseverance, patience, and also not seeing yourself as separate from the profession. See the profession as consuming you. It has to be inside of you. It's what ignites your spirit and your soul. So ideas about, I think you suggest networking or socializing. It has absolutely nothing to do with where you're going and how you're going to do it. If you think that, then there's a deficit in the persona that you bring to the profession. If you see yourself there in the future first, you will become that which you see. So the whole networking thing in the various design professions, I think, is an unnecessary consideration in getting somewhere that's mediocre, as opposed to somewhere that's original.
One last question.
Can you hear me? Yeah. My grandfather was a doctor, and I remember talking to my mother about him and going through some old paperwork of his, and he also invented surgical instruments and cost a lot of money at the time to patent them, and nothing ever really became of them then. But when we talked about him, he was an inventor. He was a doctor and he was an inventor. Nowadays we talk about designers, and the word invention kind of gets lost. For you, is there a difference between inventors and designers? If there is, what is it? And do you see it as the same nowadays?
I'll feel
Go
that
ahead, Chuck.
way. There's a difference, and I more frequently get called an inventor more frequently than I am called a designer, but I am not an inventor. I think an inventor, if I was looking for a short definition or a short distinction, is a person who comes up with an idea from the heavens or wherever it comes from a direction or attitude that starts within. That self-motivated, like in the case of your grandfather, probably had a need for something, and he pursued that until he created what he needed to create. Few designers start at that point. They are usually given an assignment to design something, and they have told what their direction is set for them, but then they have to make it work. And they have to pull it together, solve the problem. They're given the problem. And I hope I'm not too fuzzy with this. I want to say that inventors usually also come up with an idea and take it to somebody to try to sell it. And that's a tough way to go. Designers couldn't survive at that way because we have to have a client or a customer that wants something, and we can meet that need. And it's tough to sell a client something that they don't need. And I hope that helps a little bit. I would like to, frequently I get called all kinds of things other than design. And some people say, what's the difference between an inventor and an architect? or they call, no, I know what they do. They confuse industrial design with an invention. And then I said, do you know what, you have a sense of what an architect is? Fortunately, the world happens to understand architecture, the word architecture more. And I said, they'll say, yes. And I'll say, well, think of this now. An architect will design primarily for the building industry. And an industrial designer will design primarily for the manufacturing industry. Now, architects really don't invent houses or buildings. And I don't invent washing machines or television sets. That help?
Chuck, are you designing anything right now?
No. No, thank goodness.
Yeah, I'd like to thank...
I do occasionally, but I'm not today.
Yeah, I'd like to thank our panelists tonight, Chuck Harrison, Tom Kundig, Cindy Sanders, Ralph Rucci, Scott Stowell. Please extend a round of applause. Thank you very much for coming. And please enjoy the rest of the events at the Cooper-Hewitt here during National Design Week. Thank you.